And I'm going to leave it to Ed Morrissey to persuade you why that should be the case. Ed, of course, has himself relocated to southern quarters. I don't know if he ever goes north anymore, but I go from east to west. He goes from north to south. From the southern border comes the one and the only Ed Morrissey. Take it away, Captain Ed.
Good morning, everyone. This is Ed Morrissey filling in for Hugh Hewitt today. And a great Wednesday morning to everyone. We're going to have a great show for you guys today. I want to thank Hugh for giving up the mic here this morning and wish him safe travels. He's vaccinated and boosted. I'm vaccinated and boosted. And, it's nice to be able to be out and about and do those types of things without too much worry. And we're going to talk a lot more about COVID later in the show. Today, though, I think we're going to start off by not mentioning the Pittsburgh Steelers. And if you watched the last show, I know Hugh. I was all set for Hugh to come in with some sort of dig at the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I was ready to be humble about this time, because if you've watched the last few Steelers games, you realize that the less said about the Steelers, the better. So we won't be talking about the Steelers today.
How old is Ben now? Is he like 50?
The way he plays, I think they have to get him some at halftime, because that's apparently when he and the rest of the team wakes up. This team is due for a rebuild.
Don't they have to take him out to the huddle in a golf cart?
It's starting to look that way. Actually, he gets pretty nimble in the second half. For some reason, though, honestly, Dwayne, I'll talk a little bit about the Pittsburgh Steelers here. For the first time since 1940, they have been blanked in the first half of games for 5 straight weeks. That's first time in 81 years. And there were a lot of really bad Pittsburgh Steelers teams between 1940 and 1972. And this is the first time in 81 years that that's happened. This is not a team that is performing well. The only thing that they could that would possibly make them worse is if they were in Cleveland and wore brown uniforms, because they are actually behind the Steelers,
did you
but maybe not for long.
Have you seen the Browns' new logo?
No. What's the Browns' new logo?
It looks like a rabbit pushing a shopping cart. You have to.
I guess I haven't seen this.
You'll have to go look at it during the break. It's a really weird looking logo, but anyway.
Well, at least they're pushing something. That's better than the Steelers D line's been doing the last 5-6 weeks or so.
Right.
This is a disaster. This team is slowly derailing. It's the end of the Roethlisberger era, and I also think it is probably the end of the Mike Tomlin era. I think he's been there too long, and that team is not improving. I know they went 12-4 last year in a season that was shortened by COVID. There was all sorts of different things there, but this is not a team that's performing well at the moment. His team is clearly not responding to him,
right.
And I don't think they'll fire Mike Tomlin, but I think they should really be looking top to bottom at this team and rethinking their strategy after watching that performance against Kansas City. It's just pathetic from one end to the other. It was bad. And that's me coming on the Hugh Hewitt show and admitting this. Hugh is going to clip this and he's going to play it on loop. I think that the next time he's behind the mic, Dwayne, I predict that his whole first segment is clipping this 1 or 2 minutes and playing it over and over again.
Knowing his ability to turn the page, I'm sure he will. But after making a bet with Congressman Mike Gallagher about the Green Bay game, and now basically being forced to wear a cheesehead hat because he figured the Browns were going to beat the Pack easy. He's got a lot of crow eating on his end as well.
Yeah, I watched that game, and the Browns gave it away, but I will give Hugh this. The Packers got a really interesting call at the end of that game on that last interception. It was a very interesting call.
Hugh is not exactly robustly happy with the refereeing in that game.
Well, that one play, I don't blame him. The guy was tugging on the jersey. You could see it with the naked eye during the play, and somehow all the referees missed it. Hey, if the Browns put themselves in that position, if they hadn't been having a fire sale with the Rock all game long,
if Baker hadn't been picked off 4 times, that might have made a difference too.
Yeah, that might have made a slight difference too. But the Browns fans have a gripe on that last call. They have an honest, legit gripe on that last call. All right. You know who else can't play this game, Dwayne?
Democrats.
Democrats can't play this game.
One of them can play this game.
Any of the Democrats can play this game.
And
I'm not talking about football.
And it's not you and I saying this.
I'm not saying this. David Axelrod is saying this. And he's correct. Actually, I am saying this. But at least David Axelrod is also saying this, Dwayne. David Axelrod in the New York Times yesterday had a wake-up call for Democrats that they are almost certainly going to sleep through. I mean, let's face it, these guys don't want to hear that there's limits to what they can do with the congressional numbers that they've got. And David Axelrod is trying to be very nice, trying to be very polite. And I kind of like Axelrod. I mean, I don't agree with his politics, but he's the kind of guy who does usually approach politics in this manner. He's trying to nudge his friends back to reality. And at one point in his essay, and he's talking about Build Back Better, he's talking about some of the other issues too, but he's really talking about Build Back Better. That's really what he's talking about. He says, but the math is the math. In a 50-50 Senate and an evenly divided House, there are obvious limits to what can be achieved. Even Roosevelt took years to enact the New Deal. To paraphrase FDR, it's time for a rendezvous with reality and fight for what is possible. Now, I'm going to get to the math in a minute. I mean, the 50-50 part should have been stunningly obvious to the White House, even if it wasn't stunningly obvious to progressives who clearly were educated in math at their own schools. But the White House should have known better. Axelrod certainly knows better. Axelrod, and he actually references this in his New York Times essay. Axelrod talks about the fact that Barack Obama got burned. He doesn't call it overreach, but basically he got burned by overreach on the Affordable Care Act. We call it Obamacare. And some of the climate change elements that didn't pass in that first 2 years of his presidency. But the Congress looked a lot different for Obama at that point in time, which is the reason why they were emboldened to do some of these things at the time. There's no reason to do this and to do what they're trying to do in a 50-50 Senate. And yet, Dwayne, I think that David Axelrod is speaking to the wall. We're going to probably talk about this through a couple segments, but let's take a listen. I think we've got time to listen to cut number 3. Chris Van Hollen.
Chris Van Hollen last night, or 2 nights ago. Last night.
I do think that we should move forward to vote on the legislation that will cut prescription drugs, that will cut the cost of child care, that will address the climate crisis, and expand opportunities for the American people with things like universal pre-K and job training programs, because that'll show us where we are. My view, Phil, is that we've just got to vote now, and I am confident that at the end of the day, we're going to get big pieces of this initiative through.
When you think about what those big pieces will look like, have we reached a moment right now where Senator Manchin essentially just needs to put on the table what he's for, and however that meshes with the initial $1.75 trillion plan, that ends up being the outcome here? Is that kind of how you're envisioning this working?
Well, I do think at the end of the day, we're going to have to make some hard choices. But if you look at what Senator Manchin has said he's for, they include some very big pieces of this agenda. They include providing universal child care. They provide for cuts in the cost of prescription drugs. This is something many of us have been working on for a long time. More affordable child care. Also major parts of the agenda on clean energy and climate change. So there are lots of big pieces of this that Senator Manchin has expressed support for. So I do think, Phil, that we will find a way in the end. Obviously, we're not going to get everything people want, but you cannot make the perfect the enemy of the good.
Can't make the perfect the enemy of the good, but you can make the perfect the enemy of math, apparently. Senator Chris Van Hollen, speaking on CNN, I believe that was last night, talking about how they're going to have to do a vote. They're going to have to come to a vote on this. They don't have 50 votes on this. I mean, they're trying to do this through reconciliation. They don't have 50 votes, and if you read Axelrod's essay in the New York Times very, very carefully, you'll find that they probably don't have 49 either. They probably don't have 48. I'm going to guess,
You think
based
Mark
on what
Kelly wants to take that
Mark
vote?
Kelly,
John Tester?
Catherine Cortez Masto,
Maggie Hassan?
Maggie Hassan. We're going to take a look at some polls later on in the show, which show why those incumbents may not really be willing to jump in front of this particular bus, only to see it run over them anyway. When we come back, we're going to talk more about that and more of the rest of the politics for today. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh Hewitt today, and welcoming to the show my good friend Salena Zito from SalenaZito.com. Salena, great to talk to you. Maybe not so much about the Pittsburgh Steelers, though.
Who?
Yeah, I sort of did this sort of humbling experience at the top of the hour. We shall not repeat that now, but you and I offline, we need to talk about the Steelers. I mean, there's lots to talk about, but I want to talk about what you're talking about inflation and about what's going on in Middle America. As always, at SalenaZito.com, where you can find all the great stuff that Salena's writing. I was reading your New York Post column before Christmas, after Christmas, about how inflation actually impacts people, because I think that there's a vast misunderstanding of how inflation works on normal American households.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I think that a story, everyone has talked about inflation and how it's impacted people in a variety of different ways. But one of the ways I think that we have ignored is what is sort of right in plain sight, but we don't think about it, is the working poor, the people that didn't participate or haven't participated or would never even think about participating in the Great Resignation. Have, however, have worked, have never stopped working, and take great pride in working. But the way that inflation has impacted them, it's just sort of gutting them. I went to a free coat drive. It was sponsored by a local energy company in western Pennsylvania, in Brownsville, Pennsylvania, it's in Washington County. And as I'm waiting for it to begin, I watched these cars pull into the parking lot of the parents. And these cars and trucks have all seen better days, right? We've all sort of been there at some point in our life where our car is pretty rough, but it's still getting us to point A to point B. But these kids and these parents sort of pile out. The kids have no idea that their parents are there for charity. But they were there to get a brand new coat, beautiful coats. Actually, they had them for children anywhere from the age of toddler up until a teenager, and they also got to see Santa Claus. But these people are working, and inflation is killing them. They're unable to be able to provide the things, the essentials that their kids need. Not just meaning coats, but also food. Or pay their energy bills or their rent, because inflation has just cut into their budget.
Right.
If they needed to buy that used car or that old car that they pulled in with, well, good luck, because if you can even find a used car, and that's a very real problem.
Yes, it is.
They're up. The cost of a used car is up over 31%.
In large part because there's a shortage of new cars, and so people aren't trading in their old cars. These are complicated chains. An economy is a complicated mechanism. It's got lots of different moving parts, and it's the reason why, if you read F.A. Hayek, you understand why central planning never works. It's because it's just too complicated. You can't make all these decisions in real time, which is when they need to be made, which is the reason why markets work much more efficiently for this type of thing. But to get back to the inflation issue here, because I know we only got a couple of minutes, there were a lot of people out there who are saying, "Oh, inflation's really only a problem for rich people. This is a first world problem sort of thing." And you can't possibly be more wrong than this. If you're eroding people's buying power, the people with the least amount of buying power are the people who are going to get hit the hardest. And I think that's what your column is reminding us of.
Yeah, absolutely. And The even larger problem is a lot of these people don't qualify for food assistance.
Yep.
Because they make just over the amount that the federal or state governments require. So all of a sudden, they're placed in such a vulnerable position, you know. And there's a lot of people that are in this position that throw up their hands and say, okay, well, then I'm just not going to work, and I can get everything for free. I get free money, get free food, get free rent assistance, you know. All those things are available. But there's this sort of invisible population that is very prideful in terms of their identity of working. You know, that is very important to them to provide for their family, not to take a handout. And so these are the people that every day serve us, that we don't think about in manufacturing. They make sure the things that we want are available, or in healthcare, or anywhere, just about anything that we do. They're the ones that are making sure our lives are better, and they're the ones that are suffering the most during inflation.
It's absolutely true, and this is the reason why inflation is often described as a regressive tax. You can read more on this from Salena Zito. I'm sorry, not at Salena Zito. She's not on Twitter any longer because she's smart. But you go to SalenaZito.com, and you can find everything that Salena Zito is doing. Salena, great talking with you. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh Hewitt. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh Hewitt today. And joining me right now is Brian Wesbury of First Trust Portfolios, talking about the economy. And Brian, I think the first thing I want to talk about is where we're at with the Fed. I mean, this is the Fed is going to come back and try to raise interest rates, I think, in their meeting in March. They've been signaling this for some time. But they're kind of in a trap here that has been set. Politico actually has a really great piece about Thomas Honig making warnings about this during the Bernanke era. This is a bomb waiting to go off on the Fed.
Yeah, it is, Ed. It's great to be with you. And you know, I will tell you, I have thought that they have painted themselves into a corner many, many times over the last decade, really going back to the tail end of the Bernanke period. But they've been able to get out of it by bringing new tools to work. So, for example, in 2008, during that subprime crisis, that's when we started quantitative easing. The Fed really expanded its balance sheet. The interesting thing they did there is that new money that they were printing, they did not allow it to get into the economy effectively, because they just hammered banks with regulations. So the Fed grew and the banks didn't grow as much. This time, I mean, if we remember back to what we did during the pandemic, we actually paid banks to make loans. We direct deposited checks, pandemic unemployment checks, into people's bank accounts. Right. And so this time, the Fed's balance sheet has grown and the money supply has grown. We have 40% new money in the bank in the system today, and that's where this inflation is coming from. The only way they can fix it is take it out, and that's really dangerous for economic growth.
Well, I mean, we've got a kind of a preview of that. The Volcker era kind of tells us what happens when this happens. Do you think that there is a political will to draw out the poison that created the inflation? Because it's clearly not being entirely driven by a supply chain crisis. I mean, that might be a catalyst at the moment. But the real issue here is the Fed's moves over the last 12 years.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially since February of 2020. The M2 measure of money, and I know that sounds geeky, but all it means is all the deposits in all the U.S. banks. So it's all the cash. It's what Milton Friedman wanted us to watch. From February 2020 until today, it's up 40%. That money automatically flows into the system, and it devalues the dollar, not necessarily to the euro or the yen, because they're all printing more money themselves. But it devalues it, let's say, versus Christmas presents.
Yes.
I mean, think about this. The Biden administration is touting the fact that holiday spending was up 8.5% over a year ago, but inflation was up 7%. So even though you spent 8.5% more on Christmas presents, you only put 1.5% more Christmas presents under the tree. That's a really bad year. Inflation is eating away at people's spending power, and it's because we printed too much money. Supply chains matter, but it's the too much money is where inflation comes from.
In Politico's profile of Thomas Honig yesterday, which was, he was the one who was dissenting against the Bernanke policies, 12 years ago, 11 years ago, for all the quantitative easing then and that which followed. They talked about the creation of an asset bubble, and I'm wondering if you're seeing that, because that would make this, exponentially worse. Are you seeing asset bubbles being created, especially like in the housing markets?
Yeah, you know what? This is really interesting, Ed, because I probably have a little bit of a different take than a lot of people in that when you print 40% money, everything needs to go up by 40% relative to where it would have been before. So if house prices are up by 30% in Florida, they aren't going to do that again next year. But they're not. That doesn't mean they're in a bubble. They're going to go back down. It's a dollar buys less house. A dollar buys less food. A dollar buys less oil because we printed too many of them. And then when you look at stocks we're at record corporate profits, and with the low interest rates we have, I would argue that the market's value is justified. What will change that is if the Fed pushes rates up faster than the market expects. And this is where they got themselves into a conundrum. There's a thing in economics we call a soft landing. Can the Fed pump the economy up and save us from a crisis? Whether they should or shouldn't have done that doesn't matter. Can they do that and then back off without hurting us? And so far in history, they've never been able to do that.
Well, Brian Wesbury from First Trust Portfolios, we're going to keep an eye on the answer to that question. At Wesbury is where you can find him on Twitter. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh Hewitt. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Saturday Night Live. The Hugh Hewitt Show. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh today, reliving the music of my childhood, and maybe even the movies of my childhood, because let's face it, the movies of my childhood, I think, were exponentially better than some of the movies that we're getting these days. Here to discuss that with us and why we're having those issues is Christian Toto of HollywoodandToto.com, at HollywoodandToto on the intertubes on Twitter, and the author of a new book, Virtue Bombs. Let's bring on Christian first. Christian, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, Virtue Bombs, a brand new book. It's actually coming out in about 3 weeks, right?
Yes, January 18th. Virtue Bombs: How Hollywood Got Woke and Lost Its Soul. How
Hollywood got woke and lost its soul. I'm listening to the music of Saturday Night Fever, which, I don't think was the greatest movie ever made, but it was. I don't know how you make Saturday Night Fever now without references, to the Guinea Gangplank and the Guinea Gulch there. I mean, those types of things, we're not even allowed to discuss that type of thing anymore, right? I mean, West Side Story had to go completely woke between the Sharks and the Jets, of all things.
It's what we've been saying for a while now. Oh, gosh, you can't make Blazing Saddles today.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Steve Carell says, I don't know if we could do The Office today because my character was so problematic. That should stop us all in our tracks. We point to two things that are beloved in pop culture and say, oh, we can't do that anymore. That's a problem. And that's where we go with this cancel culture. It's looking back at the past. It's, examining it in a very ugly way, in a very sort of, short-sighted way, and saying that we can't do these things anymore. And please tell me that storytelling is not, corrupted by that. Of course it is.
Well, it's corrupted by a lot of things in Hollywood, and you and I have discussed the corrupting influence of China on Hollywood, not just Hollywood, by the way, the NBA, lots of other places as well. But let's focus on woke. I don't want to get too far afield from your book because you've got a lot to say in this book. And Virtue Bombs, the title Virtue Bombs has a couple of different meanings. And certainly we've seen that Hollywood is obviously not operating off of economic incentives here, Christian.
Yeah, and that's why the title is so apt. I mean, we've got movie franchises that have been crushed by this woke sentimentality. Terminator, Charlie's Angels, The Kingsman, which just came out a few weeks ago, has certainly its fair share of woke moments. It's really doing poorly at the box office. It's amazing because it's always, it's show business, and whatever makes money, that's what succeeds. Well, really? Well, then why did it take Fox News to uncork Gutfeld, a right-leaning talk show at night? I mean, couldn't you see that would be successful if someone else did it? No. They wanted to leave that money on the table because it's politics, it's woke. They didn't want to do that. And now we see that Gutfeld is a huge success.
And you and I have talked about this before. West Side Story, which just came out, is, it's only gotten, I think the last figure I saw was $36 million at the box office, and expectations for this were far higher than $36 million. I don't know what their budget was, but I guarantee you it was bigger than $36 million for a modern musical. How do you mess up a property with lyrics by the late great Stephen Sondheim, music by Leonard Bernstein, and a book that is at least credited to Arthur Lawrence, but basically is William Shakespeare? I mean, you've got Sondheim, Bernstein, Shakespeare. How do you screw that up?
Well, there's two things in play. One, with the pandemic, older audiences just have not been going back to theaters in the numbers they once did. I don't want to discount that. But, in the weeks and months running up to the film's release, all the conversations were, we want to improve on the original, and the original wasn't, culturally appropriate. And Steven Spielberg talked about how in the scenes with Spanish dialogue, he didn't want to have English subtitles because that would be inappropriate, and that would be some sort of cultural marker. So you have all this messaging, all this framing around the film saying it isn't what you loved back in the day. It isn't sort of an homage. It's something radically different. And I can't help but think that has a significant impact on the culture and on people saying, I'll wait till it's on streaming. I don't want to see it right now.
It's, getting this back into the book, I mean, this is part of the reason why Bombs is in the title, is because this type of wokery, as well as other types of politicization, right? I mean, usually produces bombs. There's very few examples of this type of heavy didactic or heavy social engineering of material actually producing a commercial success. In fact, I'd be hard pressed to cite one. Maybe you've got an example where something like that actually works in terms of box office.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is hard to come up with an example. The landscape today is so splintered that some of these products can survive with a modest audience. But when we talk about films, that has to have a much larger crowd to be successful. The West Side Story, I think I read it was $100 million budget behind that. And it's a Spielberg film. You got to expect that. You want it to look great. So, you pour all that money into it, and then you have all this sort of woke framing, and that's the results, and they only have themselves to blame.
So where does, in your book, which is Virtue Bombs, how Hollywood, I always mess up the subtitle on this, how Hollywood went woke and went broke, is that correct?
Got woke and went broke, yes.
Got woke and went broke. How Hollywood got woke and went broke. I'm going to get that. Virtue Bombs, remember Virtue Bombs, because it's available for pre-order now, which is very important to authors. So go over to Amazon and Barnes & Noble, do your pre-orders for this book. It's going to be great. Where does this start in your book? How does the woke framing in Hollywood get started?
The origins are a bit fuzzy, honestly. I think it kind of creeps up on the culture, and it's funny because 2 years ago there was a movie, No Safe Spaces, that talked about the cancel culture sentiment on universities nationwide, and it was a very powerful film and a very good film. And yet the thinking was, oh my gosh, this could creep into culture at large. And less than 2 years later, look at where we are. So I think these kind of cultural movements gain speed rapidly. So, certainly there were elements of it 5-10 years ago, but really the last 2-3 years, it just, rocket fuel was poured into it, and it's where we are right now.
Well, I think, too, though, I mean, I think we also have to acknowledge the fact that Hollywood has structured itself, and I'm talking about from the investors all the way through to the PR people. They've structured themselves for narratives and didactics. I mean, I have an extremely low opinion of The Shape of Water, which won an Oscar, and it was so bad at the box office, I immediately went home and wrote a review, and I said, this is such a bad movie, it is almost destined to win the Oscar for Best Picture. And I was right! I was right. So, I mean, in some senses, this is a machine that was already tooled, if you will, for narratives. And I mean, every film is a narrative. I mean, I don't mean to discount that. And there are some political narrative films that are actually really, really good. But the narratives in Hollywood stopped being diverse a long time ago. And the narratives now are all very narrow in one direction. That really kind of preceded the woke movement a bit, did it not?
Yeah, and that's a good point. And also, this is all self-sustaining. So I get press releases every day from different movie companies, hawking their product. And what I read is it's very, even the framing of the press release is it's progressive, this is diversity at its finest. On that level, that's what I see. But when it comes to the film critics, the people covering this industry, they, kind of double down and support this sentiment as well. As a matter of fact, if there's a movie that isn't woke, that maybe kind of breaks some of the boundaries, they'll get smacked around by the critics. They don't like that. And it's gotten so comical that, Jim Gaffigan starred in a movie a couple of years ago where he was playing a father and son, and they were troubled. And he said some of the reviews basically said, why are you focusing on a father and son? Where are the women in this movie? Now, there were women in the movie, but the focus was on a father and a son. And all of a sudden, that became problematic. So it's all these different bodies in and around the film industry working together in concert. There's no official memo sent out. It's just the way the culture is.
We're speaking with Christian Toto of HollywoodandToto.com, author of the upcoming book, Virtue Bombs, How Hollywood Got Woke and Lost Its Soul. And a great book that's going to be coming out. You should pre-order it right now. You have a whole chapter dedicated to woke critics. And you're a professional critic. I'm sort of an amateur critic. I mean, it's not what I do on a regular basis, but I write movie reviews when the mood suits me. Critics, generally speaking, have to build up some sort of level of trust with their audience in order to be influential. And what I see happening here is really squandering that trust with readers to the point where critics are almost irrelevant now in the process. I mean, it's even the Rotten Tomatoes thing. I'll go back to The Shape of Water, right? Off the charts, Rotten Tomatoes, 99%, whatever it was, some ridiculous number. That's the reason why we went to go see it in the theater. And I wanted to go back to each and every one of those critics and demand my money back at the end of that film.
If you want to laugh, go to Rotten Tomatoes and look up, I think it was either the last special or the current one by Dave Chappelle, and the split between the audience reviews and the critics reviews. Just a quick peek at my book. Someone about a year or so ago sent me a clip, as an older clip, obviously, of Siskel and Ebert, and they were talking about the rise of political correctness. And I believe this was in the mid-'90s. And it was almost like they were soothsayers about what was going to come in the critical community. And those two critics, so obviously I grew up watching and loving, they just shredded the sentiment. And you can't approach a film like that. And if you're a critic, this is the absolute worst way to assess and analyze a movie. And here we are. It's happening right now. And I really would wonder if both of those fellow were alive today, what they would say about, would they be sort of swayed by this new wave of criticism, or would they
Christian,
be aghast?
Can you stick around for one more segment?
Yeah, of course.
Excellent. Christian Toto from HollywoodandToto.com, author of Virtue Bombs. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com. We'll be right. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh Hewitt today and talking with my friend Christian Toto of HollywoodandToto.com, author of a new book called Virtue Bombs, How Hollywood Got Woke and Lost Its Soul. It's available for pre-order right now, so be sure to go out and get that. Christian, we were just talking about the critics and how that how they feed into this sort of narrative maintenance for Hollywood. What about the stars? I mean, what about the people who are actually appearing in these films? Are they willing participants in this? Are they trapped? Is it a combination of both?
it's a combination of both. I think it's really about fear. And I think Hollywood is always about fear. You know, if you're a big actor, you know, you fear losing your next gig. You fear maybe your box office isn't what it used to be. You fear the guy or gal who's coming up next, who's younger and prettier and more talented than you. I think it's based on fear, and I think that plays into what we're seeing with the woke revolution right now. Because, you know, where are all the big stars saying, hey, stop, you know, this is ridiculous. I mean, actors should act. It doesn't matter what your nationality is or your sort of your gender preference. You can, you know, a gay actor can play a straight person on screen and vice versa.
Right.
And yet these things are being called into question. And it's interesting that I think often what happens is either people lay low or they play the game, but when they're directly questioned or attacked by this new woke sentimentality, they often kind of recoil and fight back. We're seeing it right now with Aaron Sorkin. His new movie is Being the Ricardos, and you have a Javier Bardem. I believe he's a Spanish actor.
Yeah, he's a Spaniard.
And he's playing a Cuban-American, Desi Arnaz. And then you have an Australian woman, Nicole Kidman, playing Lucille Ball. So, of course, everyone's, you know, aghast at that. And now Aaron Sorkin, the writer-director, is like, no, these are our actors. These are our performers. They can do what they wish. So it's interesting when people kind of fight back. It's often when they're personally affected by this.
You know, it's interesting, too, because Bardem's fighting back against this as well, although sort of turning the wokery back on the critics, saying, how come this is always an issue when people with accents play these roles? Which I kind of chuckled. It's sort of playing along with the game as well as sort of needling back, you know, a sort of riposte in kind sort of thing. You know, I actually liked Javier Bardem in the role. I actually saw Being the Ricardos. I like both of them in the role. I mean, it's a very good film. I have some quibbles, but overall, it's a very good film, and their performances were excellent. And I think since Lucy Arnaz and Desi Arnaz Jr. were the exec producers on this thing, and Lucy Arnaz says, I believe the quote is that they were freaking amazing at portraying her parents. I'm pretty satisfied that they got the right actors to do this, and nobody was really out anything. You know, we don't have too much time, and I want people to buy the book, Virtue Bombs: How Hollywood Got Woke and Lost Its Soul. That you can get it. You can pre-order it now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other places. Pre-orders are very important. Make sure you get the pre-order in. Not only do you get the book right away, but it also helps move this up against the narratives that the national media want to use. This is very much a counter-narrative book from Christian Toto. Is there any hope that we'll get back to a Hollywood that actually just makes films? A Hollywood of the 1970s, which makes films about people rather than tent poles and all this kind of stuff, even apart from the woke and the narrative stuff. I mean, honestly, I'm not sure where that industry went.
Yeah, you know, it's a complicated situation. Certainly, we are partly to blame if we go out and see Spider-Man 12, and I enjoy the new Spider-Man. I'm not knocking that, but, you know, look at the most anticipated blockbusters of 2022. 9 out of 10, according to Fandango, are sequels. And so we do love and cherish all these blockbusters, these larger-than-life stories, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to be here and kind of complain about them. I love them as well. But certainly the industry is changing, and it does have to respond to a certain degree to what we're asking for. But, you know, I think sometimes some of the better stories, the richer stories, are popping up on the small screen. But I think one of the things that's promising, you know, hopefully down the short road, is that these alternative platforms are kind of rising up and giving us stories that are more complicated and nuanced and don't sort of feed directly into the narrative. The Daily Wire is a perfect example. They're making movies now. And, you know, The Federalist just put a new documentary on YouTube called Meet the Parents. So I think when we see more and more of these sort of different voices rising up, I think that helps the overall entertainment picture. But also, hopefully, if they're successful, it'll kind of nudge Hollywood Inc. into saying, hey, maybe we should do something a little bit different. But we'll see.
Well, I mean, really, you are sort of going up against the corporate world, thanks to all the different consolidations in the movie industry and other parts of the entertainment industry. It's going to be very difficult to change those tracks. Got about 15 seconds to let you respond to that, Christian.
Yeah, no, culture sometimes moves slowly, sometimes it moves quickly, and Hollywood is very conservative, if only in that it doesn't respond so swiftly to these demands. But it's up to the public to make it happen.
All right, Christian Toto from HollywoodandToto.com. His new book, Virtue Bombs, How Hollywood Got Woke and Lost Its Soul. Be sure to go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and any other place where you can pre-order the book. Order it now. It's important to get those numbers in there to make the media sit up and take notice. Thanks, Christian. Great talking with you. I'm Ed Morrissey, filling in for Hugh Hewitt. Have a great day, folks.